So, Margaret had been paying her family's mortgage for 5 years. 5 years of covering their bills, keeping the house running, while dealing with all the stress and pressure that came with it. And then, at Thanksgiving, out of nowhere, her mom, her own mother, calls her a burden, all while praising her unemployed brother. Can you imagine all that effort, all that sacrifice, and then to be called a burden like that? Well, that was the moment everything changed. Margaret walked out, silently canceled every payment, and from that point on, she was done. No more helping, no more rescuing. And this is where the real story begins. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. The Thanksgiving dinner was supposed to be a time for family, for connection, for gratitude. But for Margaret, it was anything but. The air in the dining room was thick, heavy, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. The scent of burnt sage and overcooked turkey lingered in the background, mingling with the faint, sharp smell of wine. But the most prominent scent was the tension. It hung in the air like a thick fog that no one seemed willing to address. But everyone could feel it was the uncomfortable silence you only get when a conversation has long passed its expiration date. And in this case, the silence had been years in the making. Margaret's hands were trembling beneath the table, hidden beneath the folds of the linen napkin she had specifically bought just for this occasion. She had spent days picking out the perfect tablecloth, setting the perfect centerpiece, because her mom, Susan, had insisted she was too overwhelmed to do it herself. But Margaret didn't mind. She wanted to make everything perfect for this meal, for this family that, at one point, meant everything to her. She had spent hours putting together the sprawling arrangement of autumn leaves and gourds, trying to make the table look warm and inviting. But in the end, it just felt hollow. Margaret's eyes kept darting over to Andrew, her brother, as he leaned back in his chair with a glass of wine in his hand, a vintage Cabernet, one that she had brought from her personal collection. He swirled the red liquid in the glass, admiring how the light caught in the crystal. He was talking, of course, as he always did, in that confident, almost cocky way that made everything he said sound more important than it probably was. The market is volatile, sure, but that's where the real visionaries make their mark. He paused, taking another sip from his glass, clearly pleased with himself. You wouldn't understand. Margaret, he said, his eyes never leaving the wine, and there's no need for you to understand. Corporate logistics as well. It's a bit pedestrian, isn't it? It's just moving boxes from point A to point B. Margaret could feel her chest tightening, that familiar knot of anxiety curling in her stomach as she listened to him. She tried to steady herself, tried to breathe deeply to keep from reacting, but it was hard because Andrew, her younger brother, the golden child, always managed to make her feel small and invisible, as if her work, her career, her struggles didn't matter in comparison to his. Well, whatever it was that he was doing, it was always something, wasn't it? The app, the vision, the dream, but it was always just that, a dream. Margaret had been holding it in for a long time, but this time she couldn't stay quiet. She looked at him, keeping her voice as level as possible. Supply chain management is a little more complex than moving boxes. Andrew, she said, her words measured but firm. It's about global infrastructure, forecasting, risk mitigation. It's the reason store shelves aren't empty. But Andrew just scoffed at her, a dismissive sound that made her blood boil. He glanced at their mother, Susan, and their father, Arthur, who were both busy pretending they didn't hear. It was a look he always gave them, a look that said he was the only one with a real vision in this family. See, she thinks she's saving the world because she tracks shipping containers, Andrew continued, turning his gaze back to Margaret. Meanwhile, I'm on the verge of closing a seed round for an app that's going to revolutionize peer-to-peer lending. Revolutionize it, he repeated with exaggerated confidence. Margaret could feel the anger bubbling inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had been the responsible one, the one who always held it together, but her patience was starting to wear thin. She looked over at her father, Arthur, who sat there, staring at his mashed potatoes, pushing a lump of butter around with his fork. He wasn't looking at anyone, not even her. He had been doing that a lot lately, shrinking into himself, as though he was too tired to fight for anything anymore. For anyone? Margaret glanced at him, her heart sinking. But then the words tumbled out before she could stop them. Andrew, you've been closing a seed round for 3 years, she said, trying to keep the edge out of her voice. Last month, you asked me for gas money. If this revolution is really happening, when exactly does it start paying the bills? And just like that, the room went dead silent. The clink of silverware stopped, the hum of conversation halted, and suddenly, all that was left was the sound of her own voice ringing in her ears. Susan's hand slammed down on the table, and the wine glasses rattled. Her face, usually composed in a mask of suburban pleasantry, twisted into a scowl so vicious it almost looked foreign. She turned her cold, icy eyes on Margaret, and her voice, though not loud, sliced through the tension like a knife. Enough. Margaret, she snapped. Why must you always be so negative? Why must you always tear him down? Margaret felt the heat rise in her cheeks, the sting of her mother's words hitting her like a slap across the face. But she fought to keep her voice steady. I'm not tearing him down. Mom, I said, the words coming out in a strained whisper. I'm asking a realistic question. You guys keep talking about his success, but I'm the one who... And then Susan interrupted, leaning forward with a force that made Margaret's heart race. You're the one who complains, Susan said, her voice dripping with contempt. You're the one who brings this toxic energy into my house every single holiday. You sit there with your expensive suit and your judgmental stare, looking down your nose at your brother. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. But she wasn't done. She wasn't going to let this slide anymore. She whispered, I don't look down on him, but I just want him to be honest. Honest, Susan laughed, a harsh, dry laugh that seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Here's some honesty for you, Margaret. You are exhausting, she said, her eyes narrowing. You come here, you pick at the food, you critique the atmosphere, and you act like a martyr. Honestly, you're just a burden. You always have been, even when you were little. You were just heavy, hard work. Unlike Andrew, Margaret's whole body went cold. The words hit her like a punch in the gut. And for a second, she couldn't breathe. She felt as if the ground had been yanked out from beneath her. You're just a burden. Margaret's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked around the table, desperate for someone to speak up, to defend her, to say something. anything that would make this feel less real. But there was no one. No one except Arthur, who had taken a sip of water and stared at the tablecloth as if it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Andrew chuckled, the low, smug sound echoing in her ears. He took a bite of turkey, chewed slowly, and then, with a grin that made Margaret's blood boil, he looked at her. "Don't take it so hard, sis. Truth hurts. But hey, at least I make this family proud. At least I have a dream." Margaret could feel her blood run cold as she looked at Andrew's smirk. She looked at Susan's hate-filled glare. She looked at Arthur's cowardice. And in that moment, the betrayal wasn't just in the insult. It was in the eraser. It was in the complete rewriting of reality that had just happened right in front of her eyes. They weren't just mean. They were delusional. And in that moment, something inside Margaret didn't just break. It solidified. It turned into something hard and cold, like steel tempered in ice. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't flip the table. She simply put down her fork. The soft clink against the china plate was the only sound that broke the silence. She stood up, and the chair legs screeched against the hardwood floor. The sound so harsh it made Arthur flinch. Margaret didn't look at any of them. She didn't even glance back at her mother or her brother. She turned her back on them, on the people who had just confirmed exactly what she was. To them, a wallet they resented. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold November night. As the door clicked shut behind her, muting the sounds of the house, she realized something. The pain she felt wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was the severing of a limb that had been gangrenous for years. The betrayal, the resentment, it wasn't about what had just happened. It was about the realization that she had been keeping them alive, and they hated her for it. The moment felt like it stretched out for an eternity. The words Susan had just thrown at her were still hanging in the air, vibrating in the thick silence of the dining room. "You're just a burden," she had said. The sting of those words landed like a blow to Margaret's chest, and for a second, she couldn't breathe. Her mind went blank. Her mother had always been the person she tried to impress. She had spent her whole life trying to do everything right, trying to prove to Susan that she was worthy of love, worthy of respect. But in that moment, all the years of sacrifice, all the money Margaret had poured into their lives, all the effort she had made to keep the family afloat, it was nothing. It was worthless. Just a burden. She could feel the heat rise in her cheeks, the blood rushing to her face, but she couldn't find the words. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. It was as if her body had frozen, trapped in the reality of what was happening. She looked around the table, hoping for some kind of intervention, but there was nothing. Arthur wasn't even looking at her. He was staring down at his mashed potatoes, pushing the butter around with his fork as if he was too tired to even meet her eyes. Andrew was grinning, a smug, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips as he chewed his turkey, completely unaffected. And Susan's eyes were cold. The rage was palpable in her voice when she snapped at Margaret, accusing her of being negative, of tearing Andrew down. Margaret's mind spun. Was that really how they saw her? Was that all she was to them? A burden. "I'm not tearing him down, Mom," Margaret finally managed to say, her voice trembling with the effort to keep calm. She could feel the anger boiling inside her, rising like a tidal wave. I'm asking a realistic question. You keep talking about Andrew's success, but I'm the one who... The words trailed off as Susan cut her off, leaning forward, her voice rising with a venomous edge. You're the one who complains, Susan said, her tone dripping with disdain. You're the one who brings this toxic energy into my house every single holiday. You sit there with your expensive suit and your judgmental stare, looking down your nose at your brother. Margaret's hands clenched into fists beneath the table. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, the sting of her mother's words cutting deeper than anything she had ever felt. She had tried so hard to be the good daughter, the responsible one. She had always done what was expected of her, got the good grades, got the career, took care of everything, and this was the thanks she got. She had expected more from her family, but what had she received in return? A callous insult. Margaret wasn't prepared for what happened next. She didn't know how to react when Susan's voice dropped, her tone suddenly cold and cruel. You're exhausting, Susan said, her eyes narrowing with contempt. You come here, you pick at the food, you critique the atmosphere, and you act like a martyr. Honestly, you're just a burden. You always have been. Even when you were little, you were just hard work, unlike Andrew. The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She felt her stomach drop, her chest tightening as if the air was being sucked out of the room. She had never heard her mother speak to her like that. Never. Her whole life, she had tried to prove herself, to show Susan that she was worthy of her love, of her approval. But this was a betrayal she hadn't seen coming. You're just a burden, Susan had said. The words echoed in her mind. It wasn't just about the mortgage, about the money she had paid for their house. It wasn't even about Thanksgiving dinner. It was everything. All the years Margaret had put herself last, all the hours she had worked, all the sacrifices she had made to make sure her family was taken care of. And for what to be called a burden, Margaret's mouth opened, but no words came out. She looked at Arthur, desperately hoping he would speak up, say something, anything, but he didn't. He just sat there, looking down at his plate, as if he couldn't bear to face her. Margaret could feel the weight of his silence, the crushing reality that he was complicit in all of this. And then Andrew, the golden child, the dreamer, spoke up. His voice was low and mocking as he chewed his turkey, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. Don't take it so hard, sis, he said with a grin. Truth hurts, but hey, at least I make this family proud. At least I have a dream. His words were like salt in the wound. Margaret could feel the bile rising in her throat. I have a dream, Andrew said, as if his failed ventures, his non-existent business, could somehow compare to the years Margaret had spent making sure they were financially stable. She looked at his smirk, at Susan's cold gaze, at Arthur's tired indifference, and something inside her snapped. The betrayal wasn't just in the insult, it was in the erasure of everything she had done for them. They had rewritten reality, and in doing so, they had destroyed the last shred of respect she had for them. They weren't just being mean, they were delusional. And in that moment, Margaret didn't just feel broken. She felt cold. She felt hard. Something inside her solidified, turning her from the daughter they had always known into someone they didn't recognize. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She didn't flip the table. She simply put down her fork, the soft clink of it against the china plate echoing in the silence. She stood up, the legs of her chair scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound so harsh it made Arthur flinch. Margaret didn't look at anyone. She didn't glance at Susan, at Andrew, at Arthur. She didn't need to. She had heard everything she needed to hear. She turned her back on them, the people who had just confirmed what they thought of her, and she walked to the front door. She opened it and stepped out into the cold November night, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that left no room for argument. As the sound of the house faded behind her, Margaret realized something. The pain she felt wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was the severing of a limb that had been gangrenous for years. The betrayal was worse than the diagnosis itself. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the realization that she had been keeping them alive and they hated her for it. The walk to her car felt surreal. The air bit at her skin, stinging her cheeks, but she welcomed it. It felt real. It felt like something she could hold on to, something she could trust. Unlike the farce she had just left behind, her legs felt heavy, like she was wading through deep water, but she kept moving, one foot in front of the other, until she reached the driver's side door of her sedan. She sat in the driver's seat for what felt like hours, just gripping the steering wheel, her knuckles white as the cold leather pressed against her palms. She stared at the house, the two-story colonial with a wreath on the door, the warm yellow light spilling from the dining room window. From out here, it looked perfect. It looked like the kind of home where a family was gathered, laughing, sharing a meal, being grateful for one another. But inside, Margaret knew the truth. They were probably already rationalizing her departure. Susan was likely pouring another glass of wine, telling Andrew, "She's just so sensitive, so dramatic. Don't let her ruin your night, sweetheart." Arthur was probably nodding, relieved that the conflict was over so he could eat his pie in peace. And Margaret, well, Margaret was done. She had been done for a long time, but now it was official. As she sat there in her car, her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, a text from Susan. "You're being incredibly childish. Come back inside and apologize to your brother, and we can move past this." The audacity. Margaret stared at the message, the anger building inside her again. She didn't reply. Then another text came in from Andrew. "Lol, drama queen much?" Margaret didn't even bother to respond. She put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway, the gravel crunching beneath her tires like bones breaking. As she shifted into drive and pulled away, watching the house shrink in her rearview mirror, something strange washed over her. It wasn't just anger. It was clarity. It was terrifying, but it was there, clear as day. They didn't know. They didn't understand. They had been living in a bubble of reality that Margaret had carefully constructed for them. A bubble reinforced by automatic transfers and silent sacrifices. They thought they were maintaining their lifestyle on Arthur's meager social security and Susan's non-existent income. They thought they were fine. But Margaret knew the truth. They weren't fine. They were living off her, and now they would have to face it. Margaret walked out of that house with a coldness she hadn't expected, and as the door clicked shut behind her, it felt like the world paused for just a moment. She had been expecting something, maybe an apology, maybe an argument, maybe even some kind of chase to get her back inside, but all she got was silence. It was the kind of silence that made the air feel heavier, more oppressive. The night was biting and sharp, but it felt oddly real, like a reminder that she wasn't part of the illusion that had been her family for so long. The drive away from the house was slow, each mile feeling like a physical separation from the years of sacrifice she had given them. Her mind was spinning, still reeling from what had happened in the dining room, from the words Susan had said to her, from the way Andrew had mocked her. "You're just a burden." Margaret couldn't shake those words. They kept replaying in her head over and over again, like a broken record. She thought about her whole life, all the things she had done for them, paying their mortgage, making sure the bills were always covered, working endless hours so they never had to worry. And now, all of that was being thrown back in her face. But as she drove, something started to shift inside her. The anger, the frustration, it was still there, but it was starting to settle into something else, something colder, something more calculated. The silence from her family was louder than any of their voices could have been. The phone didn't buzz with emergency texts from Susan asking if she had paid the bills, or from Andrew asking for money. There was nothing, not even a call from Arthur, not even to check if she was okay. That silence, that absence, it was a sign. It wasn't a punishment. Not to Margaret. It was a window of opportunity, and Margaret knew exactly what she needed to do with it. She wasn't just angry anymore. She was focused. The first thing she did when she got home was make herself a drink. It wasn't about numbing herself, it was about marking the shift in her mindset. She'd been the emotional one, the one who had kept everything together. But now she needed to think like a strategist. She went straight to her laptop, sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the screen for a moment before she logged into her bank account. There it was, the recurring payment for the mortgage, $2,400 a month. She'd been doing this for years, paying the mortgage, paying the utilities, making sure the house stayed afloat while her parents and brother lived in denial. But now, she was going to stop. It wasn't just about walking away emotionally. It was about taking control of her life, her money, her future. She clicked on the recurring transfer, her cursor hovering over the cancel button. For a moment, she hesitated. She thought about Arthur's sad eyes, about Susan's guilt-tripping texts, about Andrew's mockery. But then she remembered the words her mother had said. "You're just a burden." If that's how they saw her, if that's how they truly felt, then she wasn't going to keep funding their lifestyle. She wasn't going to keep letting them live in a bubble of comfort while she paid for it. She wasn't their lifeline anymore. Margaret clicked. Cancel. A confirmation box popped up. "Are you sure you want to cancel this recurring transfer?" "Yes," she said to herself. "I'm sure." With one click, the first thread of the financial connection was severed. She leaned back in her chair, the weight of it all settling over her. She wasn't going to feel guilty. She wasn't going to backtrack. She had done this for long enough. They were grown adults. If they needed help, They could find a way to ask for it without relying on her to foot the bill. After canceling the mortgage payment, Margaret moved on to the utility companies: electric, gas, water, internet. All of them were in Arthur's name, but they were all linked to her credit card for autopay. She had done it all, managed their accounts, kept their finances in order. But now, she had to remove herself completely. Remove card, remove card, remove card. It was methodical, precise. She wasn't doing this out of spite. She wasn't doing this because she hated them. She was doing it because they had crossed a line. They had taken her for granted, used her generosity as if it were something they were entitled to. But now, it was over. She wasn't their ATM anymore. By the time she finished removing all of her financial ties from the household, it was past midnight. The house was quiet. The world outside her window was dark, the street lights casting long shadows across the driveway. Margaret stood up, her body feeling lighter, like she had just removed a heavy weight from her shoulders. The anger was still there, but it wasn't consuming her. It was more like a fuel now, something she could use to keep moving forward, to keep going with this new plan she had started to piece together. The next morning, the silence continued. No frantic texts, no calls asking if she had paid the bills. Nothing. Margaret went about her day, trying to keep her mind on work, on everything except the quiet that had overtaken her life. But it wasn't just silence, it was a kind of peace, a peace that she hadn't known she needed until she had it. The more she thought about it, the more clear it became. This wasn't just about money. This wasn't just about her family asking her for help. This was about something deeper. It was about respect, about boundaries, about finally taking control of her life, her money, her future. And it was about taking herself out of the equation. Margaret didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if her family would ever truly understand what she had done, why she had done it. She didn't know if they would even care, but she knew one thing for sure: she wasn't going back. This time, it was on them. They could figure it out. They could live without her money, without her support. If they wanted a comfortable life, they'd have to find a way to make it happen themselves. Margaret wasn't their safety net anymore, and that felt like freedom. But the silence wasn't going to last forever. Eventually, the questions would come, the phone calls, the demands, and when they did, she'd be ready. This wasn't just an emotional decision anymore. It was a strategy, a plan, and Margaret was in control now. Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The more she thought about it, the more the pieces of Andrew's story didn't fit. He had been talking about this app he was supposedly building for years now. It was always right around the corner, always just about to take off. He had this grand vision of revolutionizing peer-to-peer lending, a billion-dollar idea, he claimed. But Margaret knew better. She had been in business long enough to recognize when someone was full of it. The signs were everywhere. Andrew's so-called business was vague, constantly shifting, and never seemed to get anywhere. He always had an excuse: his website was being redesigned, his investors were busy, or his app was in beta. But in all the years of hearing this, Margaret had never once seen anything tangible. No product, no launch, no investors, just empty promises. That night, after the confrontation at Thanksgiving, when Margaret had severed all financial ties to her family, she sat in front of her computer with a growing sense of determination. She needed answers. She had already started to distance herself from them, but now she wanted to uncover the truth. She wasn't just going to walk away from this family, from everything she had given them, without knowing exactly what had been going on behind the scenes. She started with the basics. She opened a new tab on her browser and typed in the name of Andrew's company, Lensphere. She expected to find something, anything, that would confirm the legitimacy of the business he had been hyping for years. Instead, she found nothing. No website, no registered company under that name. Nothing. It was as if it didn't even exist. Margaret sat back in her chair, frowning. This wasn't right. She typed the name again, tweaking it slightly, trying variations, Lensphere LLC, Sphere Lending, even just Lensphere by itself. Still, nothing. She took a deep breath, her suspicions rising. If there was one thing she had learned in her years of managing logistics and financial planning, it was how to dig deep when something didn't add up. She wasn't going to let Andrew get away with this. Margaret opened a new search tab and went straight to the State Business Registry database. If Andrew had truly founded a company, there had to be a record of it. She typed in the name again, and this time she added a filter for business filings in their state. The result was the same nothing, not a single record under that name. Margaret felt a chill run through her. How could he have been claiming to raise a seed round for a company that didn't even exist? Something wasn't adding up, and she was going to get to the bottom of it. She needed more. Margaret clicked over to LinkedIn, the platform where Andrew had been bragging about his visionary work. She found his profile easily. It was polished, filled with the usual buzzwords: CEO and founder at Lensphere. He had a couple of vague lines about disrupting the fintech space, about his revolutionary vision. But when she looked deeper, things started to get even murkier. She glanced at his connections, his employees, and that's when she found it the smoking gun. One of his supposed employees was a guy she vaguely recognized from high school, a guy who had never really done anything with his life, certainly not anything related to tech or business. According to Andrew's LinkedIn, this guy was the chief marketing officer. The other employee listed was a stock photo of a woman, one of those generic images that appeared on a million other websites. Margaret had learned a long time ago how to spot fake profiles and scams, and this was as fake as they come, but that wasn't enough. Margaret wasn't going to jump to conclusions without more concrete evidence. She needed something solid, something undeniable. So, she called in a favor. Margaret had a friend named David, someone she had known from her business network, who worked in venture capital due diligence. They'd had lunch a few times, and she knew David had access to resources that could help her. The next day, they met at a diner. David was eating a sandwich, wiping mustard off his lip when Margaret laid out the situation. She told him about Andrew's company, about the seed round, and about the supposed investors. Lensphere, David said, shaking his head. I've never heard of it. If they were raising money around here, I would know. The circles are small. Who's the lead investor? Margaret paused. She didn't know the answer to that. Andrew had never mentioned a lead investor, but she'd heard him talk about it like it was a sure thing. David took a sip of his water and smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. Look, Margaret, he said, his voice dropping a little. I ran a quick background check on your brother, just the basics, since you asked. And Margaret, he's not raising money. He's being chased by it. Margaret's stomach dropped. What do you mean? She asked, her voice suddenly tight. David's eyes narrowed. He has 3 judgments against him in small claims court from his last venture. Unpaid vendors, loans, that kind of thing. Margaret's mind was racing. Andrew. Her brother, the successful entrepreneur, his credit score is sub 500. David continued, almost casually. No reputable VC is going to touch him with a 10-foot pole. If he's getting money, it's not from investors. It's from informal sources. Or family. The words hit Margaret like a punch to the gut. Her worst fears were coming true. Andrew hadn't been building a business. He had been playing pretend, living in a fantasy world where he was a successful CEO of a thriving company. But the reality was much darker. He was a fraud, and he had been leeching off their family's finances to keep his illusion alive. Family, Margaret whispered, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. It was all starting to make sense now. Andrew had always come to her when he needed money, and she had given it to him. But now, she realized that all along, he had been using her to fund his failed ventures, to keep up the pretense of success. He wasn't just a dreamer, he was a parasite, and her family had been enabling him. Margaret's hands were shaking as she left the diner. She had what she needed. Now confirmation, but there was still more to do. The next step was to prove it. Margaret spent the rest of the night going through old bank statements, digging through the PDFs she had saved when she had access to her parents' accounts. She knew she had to be careful. Her parents had changed their passwords a year ago, but the statements from before that time were still there, available for her to review. She started with the withdrawals. August 2022, $5,000. Andrew had told them it was for server space, but when Margaret looked into the cost of server space for a non-existent app, she found the price was nowhere near that high. The next one was from December 2023, $3,000 for legal fees for patenting. Margaret ran a quick USPTO search for his name. 0 results. The fraud was right there in black and white. Andrew wasn't just a failure. He was a scam artist, and he had been draining their family's finances while pretending to be a successful entrepreneur. Margaret saved the file as the audit XLSX. She knew what she had to do next. She wasn't going to keep playing the game. She wasn't going to let Andrew get away with this any longer. But she also knew it was going to take time. The first domino had fallen, and now she had to wait for the rest of the pieces to collapse. It was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. Margaret sat at the head of the conference table, the evidence laid out in front of her like a weapon. The thick manila envelope sat there, an ominous presence in the center of the table. It was quiet, the kind of silence that filled a room just before a storm. She had spent so much time preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, her hands were steady, her mind clear. She wasn't angry anymore. She wasn't emotional. She was calm, detached, like a businesswoman preparing to present a case. The door to the conference room opened, and her parents walked in first. Arthur looked exhausted, his face pale, and his coat rumpled as though he had been sleeping in it, probably because his house had no heat. His eyes flickered nervously around the room, avoiding Margaret's gaze, as if he already knew something was wrong. Susan walked in next, her hair pulled tight into a ponytail, her expression a mix of anxiety and resentment. She glanced at the pristine conference room with its sleek glass walls and mahogany table, but there was no awe, only disdain. And then Andrew, looking just as smug as ever, strutted in with a bright, too-perfect smile plastered on his face. He wore a suit that was a little too shiny, his leather briefcase swinging from his hand like some sort of prop in a play. The arrogance radiated off of him like heat. He looked around the room, unimpressed. "Nice setup," Andrew said, flopping down into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "A bit corporate for my taste. Though, lacks creative energy, but, it pays the bills. I guess." Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't say anything. She wasn't here to argue with him. She was here to present the truth. "So," Andrew continued, still not looking at her, "are we here to resolve this nonsense? Your father has caught a cold because of your little stunt with the heating?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. Her heart didn't race anymore. She wasn't shaking with anger. Instead, she felt a strange sense of calm. "My stunt," Margaret asked, raising an eyebrow. "I didn't turn off the heat." "Mom, the power company did because the bill wasn't paid." She glanced at Andrew, who had been too busy playing pretend to handle something as simple as paying the electricity bill. "I assumed you, with your impending millions, would have handled a $200 electric bill." Andrew waved a dismissive hand, a practiced shrug that reeked of entitlement. "I told you, my assets are illiquid right now. There was a fraud alert when I tried to send the wire. It's complicated. You know how banks are." Margaret fought the urge to roll her eyes. This was the same tired excuse she had been hearing for years now. "Actually," she said, opening the file in front of her and sliding a piece of paper across the table, "I do know how banks are, and I know that's not how they work." Susan's face twisted with impatience. "We're not here for a lecture, Margaret," she snapped, her voice sharp. "You said you wanted to negotiate." Margaret pushed the paper forward, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. "Here's the negotiation," she said coolly. "You turn the auto pay back on, you pay the back mortgage, and you apologize to your brother for embarrassing him. In exchange, we'll forgive you for ruining Christmas." Her voice was even, measured, and detached nothing like the woman she had been just a few months ago. The one who had been at the mercy of their expectations, their demands. "You've been living in a fantasy," Margaret continued, leaning forward, "and it's time you wake up." She watched their faces as the words sank in. Arthur's eyes were wide now, desperate, as if he couldn't fully comprehend what was happening. "Please, Margaret," he said, his voice trembling. "Can we just fix this? It doesn't have to be like this. It's Thanksgiving. It's Christmas. Can't we just move past it?" Margaret's gaze didn't falter. "I'm going to fix it, Dad," she said softly, "but not the way you think." She slid the next piece of paper across the table. Arthur picked it up, squinting at it in confusion. "What is this?" he asked. "That's a $20,000 personal loan taken out in your name 3 months ago," Margaret said, her voice growing cold. She watched him carefully as he scanned the document, his face contorting as he saw the signature at the bottom. "Look at the signature," Margaret said, her words deliberate. Arthur frowned, his hand shaking as he lifted the paper closer to his face. The words seemed to hit him one at a time, like a slap that grew harder with each revelation. "He handled the paperwork for me," Arthur said. his voice wavering. He said it was for refinancing the car. To get a better rate, Margaret's eyes darkened. It wasn't for the car. "Dad," she said, her voice low, controlled. It was a high-interest cash loan. The money was deposited into Andrew's account, and look where it went. She pushed the photos across the table, the damning proof that Andrew had been using their money for gambling. Andrew shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face flushing as the evidence stacked up against him. "This is an invasion of privacy," he shouted, slamming his fist down on the table. "You hired a PI? Are you psychotic?" Margaret. But Margaret wasn't fazed. "Sit down," she said, her voice steady, even colder than before. Andrew hesitated, but then sat back down, clearly trying to regain some sense of control. Susan, on the other hand, was staring at the photos, her face a mixture of disbelief and denial. "He likes to play cards," Susan said, her voice shaking. "So what, it's a hobby?" Margaret's jaw tightened. "It's not a hobby when he's stealing from you to fund it," she snapped. "This is where the money went: DraftKings, FanDuel, gambling. Look at the transaction codes." She slid the bank records over to Susan, who picked them up with trembling hands. Susan stared at the numbers, her eyes growing wider with each transaction, each withdrawal. But Margaret wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower, harder. "And here's the thing," she said. "Lensphere doesn't exist. There's no company, no seed round, no investors. Your golden child is a fraud." She slid the state business registry search results, which showed nothing under the name of Lensphere. And Andrew's credit report, he's unemployed, has been for years. He spends his days at a co-working space playing Call of Duty, not working on a visionary business. Andrew opened his mouth to argue, but Margaret cut him off. "I have the logs from your Wi-Fi network." "Andrew," she said, her voice ice cold. "I know what you're doing." The room went silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the HVAC system, a sound that seemed so out of place now that the truth had been laid bare. Andrew was still glaring at her, his jaw working, but he didn't deny it. He couldn't. The evidence was irrefutable. Margaret turned to her mother. "You looked at him, didn't you?" "Mom, you saw the facade. You saw the lies, but you wanted to believe them. Didn't you?" Susan didn't answer. Her head bowed. For the first time in her life, Margaret saw the veil lift. She saw her mother look at Andrew and see the tarnish, the rot beneath the shiny surface. "Andrew," Susan whispered, her voice broken. "Is this true?" Andrew's face contorted with anger, and he slammed his hand down on the table. "You don't understand," he shouted. "I'm building something. I'm a visionary. Margaret's just jealous because she's a drone." A cog in the machine. Margaret's chest tightened, but she didn't let the emotion show. "I'm the cog that paid for the roof over your head," she said, her voice rising now. "I'm the cog that paid for the food in your stomach. I paid the mortgage for 5 years. Andrew. Me." While you played pretend, she turned to her parents. "He has drained you. He stole your emergency fund. He forged Dad's signature. And when the heat went off, he let you freeze rather than admit he didn't have $200. Arthur's hands were trembling now, his eyes glazed with disbelief. "You forged my name," he whispered. To gamble, Andrew's face twisted with rage. "I was going to win it back. I had a system," he screamed. But Margaret wasn't finished. She looked at Susan. He let you sit in the dark. Mom, he let you freeze while he spent your money on his delusions. And you still defend him. You still think he's the golden child. Arthur stood up slowly, his face hardening with an expression Margaret had never seen from him before. "Get out," he said, his voice low but full of authority. What Andrew scoffed, still reeling from the accusations. "Dad, don't be dramatic." "Get out," Arthur repeated, louder now, his voice like thunder. "You stole from me. You lied to us. You let your mother sit in the dark. Get out of this office and don't come back to the house." Susan's eyes filled with tears, but they weren't the angry, defensive tears Margaret had seen so many times. These were different. These were the tears of a woman realizing the truth. "You said you made us proud," she whispered, looking at Andrew. "You lied." Andrew sneered and grabbed his briefcase. "Fine. Whatever. You're all holding me back anyway." He stormed out of the room, leaving the door slamming behind him. And just like that, the parasite was gone. Margaret didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel victorious. She felt relieved. The truth had been exposed, and though the fallout was far from over, she finally had the closure she had been searching for. After everything that happened, things between Margaret and her family were never the same. The dynamic had shifted permanently. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was about facing the truth, something they had all been avoiding for years. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't feel like the burden. She wasn't the one holding them together, sacrificing herself for a family that only saw her as a means to an end. That weight had been lifted. Her family had been forced to face the consequences of their actions. And for once, they couldn't blame Margaret. They had to look at themselves, really look at what they had allowed to happen. And while the fallout was painful, it was necessary. Arthur and Susan had been forced to confront the lies they had been living under, and though it wasn't easy, they started to rebuild. Susan didn't criticize Margaret's career anymore. She didn't see her as a threat or a failure. In fact, she had started to respect her. When she introduced Margaret to the neighbors at their new condo, she didn't hide behind her usual judgments. She said, "This is Margaret. She's a senior manager in logistics. She's very successful." The words were different now. There was a hint of fear in her voice, though fear that Margaret might leave again. That fear wasn't a bad thing. It was a reminder of how far they had come and how much they had lost. As for Margaret, she had reclaimed her life. She wasn't just the daughter anymore. She was her own person, free from the guilt and the burden of carrying the weight of her family's mistakes. She was rebuilding, too, in ways she hadn't expected. The Thanksgiving dinner wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a new chapter. Her relationship with her parents was different, but it was still there. It was recovering. Margaret still visited, still shared dinners, but she didn't bring the wine or pay for the groceries. She brought herself, and that was enough. The shift wasn't perfect, but it was real. As for Andrew, well, he disappeared. After his eviction from the family, there was nothing left for him. He couldn't keep up the illusion of success without Margaret's money and without her support. His entrepreneurial dreams crumbled. He had to face the consequences of his actions, too. And though Margaret had no illusions about him ever truly changing, she knew he would have to find his way. or not. And her family. They were still learning, still adjusting, but Margaret had broken the cycle. She had shown them the truth, and now they had to live with it. If you've been following along with this story, don't forget to hit that like button if you enjoyed it, and if you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure to subscribe. I'll see you next time, and remember, sometimes walking away is the best way to find yourself.